Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Amsler, and I'm here with Pastor Bob Stauffer, and welcome to Ask the Pastor. This is new for us here at Bethany, but as you know, the virus has cut off much of the normal communication that we've had in the past, and so we thought that maybe it would be appropriate to communicate with you through this question and answer series. So what I'd like to do is give you a little background about where we've gotten to here at the end of April, and then I have a few questions for Bob that will maybe help you understand a little bit about more what's going on here at Bethany. So as you know, at the beginning of January, Pastor Peter informed us he would be resigning, and he did so at the end of January. And we were lucky enough to have Bob helping us out through January as a moderator for our session, and he also moderated our congregational meeting. And when we found out Pastor Peter would be resigning, Bob told us he would be available to be our transitional pastor. So at the February session meeting, the session approved that, and we hired Bob for a period of 1 year to be our half-time pastor. So I can tell you right now, I believe we are very fortunate to have Bob Stauffer with us. He has brought a tremendous amount of energy and optimism to Bethany. And I am really looking forward to spending the next year working with him. So in the past 10 or 15 years, we've had different interim pastors, but something is very different this time. We are part of a different denomination. We are now a member of the EPC, and the EPC looks at the transition between pastors very differently, and I believe that is going to be a good thing. So one of the things that is different now is that before we had an interim pastor, and the EPC now calls that a transitional pastor. So I'm going to ask Pastor Bob, what is the role of the transitional pastor in the EPC?
Well, thanks. Good to be doing this. Couple of things. One is there is an intentional change of language there. Interim pastor implies a time period. It's from this time to this time. And so typically in past days and other denominations, they saw this interim time as a time period, and certain things had to happen there during that time period. We use the word transitional because it's a process. So it's not related, the transitional time is not related to this takes 12 months or 18 months or 5 months or whatever it is. It implies that there's a process that we work through, and however long that process takes, that's what we do. So that's why we intentionally use the word transitional. And we'll talk more about that later. But in terms of my responsibilities, that is something that is contracted between the session and the transitional pastor. So this is an act of the session to call a transitional pastor. Why the whole congregation is not involved. This is a sessional activity. And so a contract is worked out, specifically says, here are some of the things that I will do, here are some of the things that I really won't have the opportunity to do, particularly because I'm half-time, I'm still working for the presbytery and taking on my role there in church health. So we had to be very careful about what it was I could do and couldn't do. And so we talked a lot about things like helping with the church health process. That's helping to evaluate everything that's going on. Just maybe asking questions. Why does the church do this? Because sometimes churches haven't thought about those things for a long time, or fall into certain habits, or just things evolved a certain way. So my job is to be the sand in the oyster. I'm the irritant that just asks questions. How did we get to this place? And is there a better way to do this? Is there another way to think about this? And I've had the blessing of being both the National Outreach Director for our denomination and also the role I've had in presbytery. So I've been in hundreds and hundreds of churches working through a process like this. So to get to the contract situation, For example, one of the things I won't be able to do because of my time limitations is I won't be able to do a lot of visitation. I won't be able to be doing a lot of caring for shut-ins and elderly, things that I love and are dearly important and significant to the church, but I'm not going to have the opportunity to do those things. Grateful for you and Sue, who are taking on many of those roles and thinking through that. So my role is basically related to preaching 2 out of 3 Sundays. And working along with Dr. Valentine, who you've met and will be preaching more. And then helping the church think through all the elements of a transition. What does that look like? What are the things we need to question? What are the things we might want to talk about doing differently? So that's all outlined in a specific contract that we have with the session that anybody who's able to see if they'd like to see that.
Right, in that contract, we did agree and we understand that you don't have the time to do a lot of visitation, so our deacons are good at that. Sue's been helping with that, so we understand that, and that's going to work out just fine. So one of the things that I know you did have planned, and we had it on the calendar, and it's very important to the transitional process, is something you call the Vitality Seminar. And we had that planned for April 24th, but due to the virus, we had to cancel that. So would you tell us just a little bit about the Vitality Seminar and what role that plays in the transition?
Sure. Well, the Vitality Seminar basically helps the church outline the process for a transition. Well, actually, in a broader sense, outline the process toward greater church health. And so the purpose of the seminar is to help a church look at itself, some self-assessment tools. And again, we've learned over a period of time that for somebody else to assess a church is hard because they come in, they observe some things, and the people who've been here 50 years say, you don't know what you're talking about. So self-assessment tools are much more valuable. So the first part of the seminar is really basically an act of repentance. Like, what have we not been as the church that God called us to do? And to take seriously what we have and have not done in the past as a church. And I really believe repentance and forgiveness lays at the heart of a foundation for church health. If you don't have those things, it's very difficult to move on. So first part of the seminar deals with that. The second part helps churches do some assessment. We use a life cycle curve and talk about where is the church health on the life cycle and what are the characteristics of that life cycle and how do we know where we are as a church. And so then the church puts themselves on the life cycle, and it's a very valuable tool in that self-assessment process. And then the next part of the process is helping the church begin to think through mission and vision, to think through the difference about being attractional, which is how the church has operated for many generations now. The idea is, how many people can we get in here? And that's a process that works in a very church culture. When people are deciding not will we go to church, but where will we go to church, that's a very different thing than what we find in our culture today, which isn't even by and large asking the question of church. And so the church has to take an entirely different posture. Rather than being attractional and how many people can we get in here, the idea is, how will the church move outside of its walls and really engage the community to see people come to Jesus? And that's a big shift in lots of churches' thinking. So we spend a lot of time in that. And then the third part of the seminar is helping the church begin to think through mission and vision. Where are we go? Who are we? Where are we going? What's God called us to do? What are our unique resources and gifts that we have to offer to mission and vision? And then how do we begin to think about moving outside of our walls to have an impact in our community? And lots of examples around that, and working around tables. And so it's a very, very valuable process. All of that is intended to lead to the formation of a vision team. And that vision team then helps us move forward, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's kind of it gives so much background in terms of how to think differently about church. So obviously we weren't able to have that, and we don't know when we'd be able to have that. We've had about almost all of the churches in our presbytery have gone through the seminar, and we have probably about 50 churches who are using this process and seeing God do amazing things. So we're going to have to rethink that, because I think there's parts of that will be good to communicate. We'll just have to figure out how best to communicate it, and then move on to what we need to do.
Yeah, the Vitality Seminar is something that we may try to share with the congregation in various ways, and we're still thinking about that. We know it's important, and we want to engage people in that in some fashion. So we'll go on to the next question. And this is a question I have gotten from several people. And people are asking, when will we be forming the pastor search team?
I have no idea. Oh, you want more than that? So again, this goes back to the idea of not an interim, but a transitional process. So there are 3 phases to a transitional pastor process. The first is assessment. So some of you have received the SWOT calls, and many of those I've done. And then various tools to help a church self-assess what that all looks like. Because I really don't feel like we can go anywhere until we know who we are. What is the identity and the culture of Bethany, and what do the people feel about the church? So just completed almost 80 calls with people, and so I think I'm getting a feel for that. Heard lots of stories, which is really great, and gives me a sense of that identity. So we'll be doing some other self-assessment tools that we can use. The session, we'll be doing that with me. So the first phase is self-assessment. And again, that's not a time period, it's however long it takes to do that assessment point well. The second phase is what we call mission and vision. So helping a church identify its purpose. In other words, who are we called to reach? Develop a strategic plan for how we can begin to reach them. Set goals, certain time periods for when we will see this implemented. How do we need to change our interior structure? How do we need to change the structure of Bethany in order to do that well? And so that follows along the timeline with the vision team as they kind of lead that process, give it to the session, and then the session gives it back to an implementation team who then begins to say, okay, we know who we're called to reach, we know basically how we're going to do it, we know what the goals are, now let's go put it in place and begin that process. So that the third phase can begin, which is the search process. So I've been parts of hundreds and hundreds of search teams, and the question that I always ask them is, who are you, where are you going, what's your mission and vision, and how are you going to get there? Because if you don't know that, how in the world are you going to look for a pastor? It's sort of like just throwing darts against a wall. Yeah, somebody's going to come, but do they share your mission? Do they share your vision? So the primary question for the search team is then, given all that we know from this transitional process, given that we know who we are, where we're going, where we're called to go, what we're called to do, timelines, goals, who will be the best person to help us get to the place that God has called us to go? So then the search process actually becomes a much quicker process. With all of that in place, then when a search team goes to search for the pastor, they can easily hold up this profile and say, this is who we are, where we're going, etc. And this is the person. Do those match? If not, no. No. Oh, that one looks a little better. That's pretty much who we're looking for. And so that process becomes both an intentional process because you've answered the right questions, and a faster process because you know exactly what you're looking for. Now, obviously people start asking, well, how long does that take? I really don't know, because it's a process, not a time period. So some churches can move through that fairly quickly. Some churches, it depends on the dysfunction of the church and crises in the church and difficult times or good times. So it can take as little as 14 or 15 months. It can take 24 months, depending on the level of the church. So there is no time frame, and it could go, I assume it could go faster or longer too, obviously, given certain circumstances, but that's why we call it the transitional process.
And it seems like, from the pastor's point of view, it would be much better to come across a church who knew who they were and where they were headed and what their mission was, than a church that really didn't understand any of those things.
Of course, what most search team and churches don't understand, they think they're searching for a pastor, but they also have to recognize the pastor is searching the right place for he or her and their family. I mean, they may be moving or coming from it's a big commitment to come to a place. And so if that pastor comes and he's actually interviewing the search team saying, where are you going, what are you doing? And the answer is, we have meetings, we have Bible studies, that's not a good indicator of where the church is. But if they can say, here's specifically where we believe God's called us to go. We've been really thinking about this and processing it. We have a very clear vision of what God wants us to do, and we want somebody to be a part of that. I'll sign up for that every single day. It is a compelling thing for a pastor in the search process.
Good. You mentioned that you've been making what you call SWAT calls. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. Well, a lot of you know about it, obviously. One of the things I wanted to do is get to know people. So we've been talking a lot about families and histories and who knows who and crossovers and who's related to who, which is always the key in churches, right? The SWOT really stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So I'm asking people, what do you see the strengths of Bethany to be? What are the weaknesses? What are opportunities that we have to really reach out into the community? And what are some threats that if we don't address them, will be very detrimental to Bethany moving forward into mission and vision? So almost 80 calls now, and my goal with this is not to have somebody said this. My goal with this is to form a composite picture. Over 80 people, here's some of the big themes that I want to present to session and to any leadership people that want to know. Well, anybody that wants to know, actually. But it gives us that good start to a self-assessment tool that answers questions about identity and culture and what people feel about the church, where are the pitfalls. People have presented opportunities for outreach that I wouldn't be able to know or have thought of. So as a tool for the vision team to have behind them is a powerful tool beginning for them to move into their process.
And I believe you always in the past conducted these SWAT interviews person to person, right? So it's been a little tough with the virus, but you've managed to connect with people by phone. So we do what we have to make it work. So
well, we started, obviously we wanted to do the face-to-face, and then was, well, can we do these by Zoom and phones? And we launched into the first person that I was calling doing that, and about an hour in, we still had not figured out how to connect face-to-face. And I thought, well, I'll be doing this for 100 years if we do it this way. So yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of how we had to do it given the context, but I think it worked out fine. The results are the same, so that's good.
good. The other thing you mentioned was a vision team. And what's the vision team and what's the purpose?
Yeah, the vision team has a number of purposes. So this would be 7 or 8 people from the church, selected by the session. The session approves who would be on the team. And that team has a number of purposes. The first is to do what I call exegeting the community. Simply going around the community and asking people what are ways that Bethany Church could serve the community well. So superintendents of schools, principals, nurses in the schools, chief of police, mayor, whatever the people are who know the community. What we have found is that many people, even if they've lived in a community for a long time, think they know the whole community, but they probably only know parts of it. And so this is a way to ask the question in a broad way, how can we best serve this community? And then prayer becomes a significant part of what they do. So that group will be prayer walking, the community, the schools, wherever we have the opportunity to do that in the community, simply asking the question, God, where do you want us to go? What would you have us to do? Because for me, vision is not about creativity. It's not about something we can make up and ask God to bless. Vision is about God is going to call us somewhere. We have to hear his voice and go where he calls us to go. And so if we're doing this in our own strength, we're just taking a walk around the community. But when God's in it, powerful things begin to happen. And then that group begins to form, once we answer the question, where are we called to go? What has God called us to, where has he called us to serve well in this community? Then we begin to ask questions like, all right, well, how will we do that? How do we form objectives around this? When will we do it? What will this look like? Who will do it? Who internally may we need to put in a different place in order to do this well? Then they take all of that information, they hand it to session, because session is the ruling body of the church. Session looks at it, they may tweak it, they may say, hey, have you thought about this? Whatever they want to do with it. Then they will hand it back to a group of people. At that point, we call the implementation team. Many of those same people may stay on. Other people who are, if we're called to reach the schools, we may bring on some teachers. If we're called to reach a trailer park, somebody from that trailer park who really knows those people well. Then that group is responsible for then implementing the process that the vision team has created, given to the session, and approved.
It sounds like a big job,
It is a big job.
being on the vision team.
Mm-hmm.
As part of the transition period, I have heard you say that we are going to look at everything. What does that mean?
So again, my role, one of the great advantages you have as a transitional pastor, you have no biases toward people or situations or circumstances. You are just an observer. You're looking at what's going on around the life of the church and asking questions. How did this come to be, and why is this, or why do we have two houses, and how did that come to be, and what are we going to do with that, and who do we have as staff, and how did they get here, and how did that process develop, and is that what's needed, is that what's going to move us forward? What about the physical facility? If it's a great facility, as this one is, how can we use it in other ways? What ways can we use the community? So I basically see the transitional pastor is naively, basically, just asking questions about everything. And often there are very good answers for all of those things. Sometimes the answers are, I don't know how we got here. Just over time, this is how it happened, or why did this happen? I don't know why it happened. It just, something happened here, and this happened, and then we were down a path that we didn't know how to get back from. So, and that's not a criticism, it's an observation. So my goal is to present to session observations. Here's what I said. So now I have 80 calls going in, and I can make observations based on those kinds of comments. So basically my role is to just look around and ask the question, how did we get here? Why is this like this? Is there a better way? I'm not saying there is or isn't, but is there a better way? Or here's my experience through the hundreds of churches I've been a part of, and this seems a little out of balance with what my experience is. So I kind of have that reservoir to draw on as well. But it really is that role, just basically calling everything I can think of into question.
Okay. Now, I have noticed that one thing that you do emphasize, and one thing I think is vitally important, but maybe we have not put the correct perspective on it, is outreach. And could you just tell us a little bit about the role that outreach plays in a church?
Sure. Well, the premise for my feeling about that is a biblical premise. I believe that in Matthew chapter 28, there's a passage called the Great Commission, and in that passage, God has given us the purpose statement of the church. So I think we ought to start with that. If God has said, this is what the church is supposed to be doing, then that probably is what the church should be doing. So rather than kind of creating its own stuff and moving around. So obviously the Great Commission talks about us, beginning of the Great Commission is talking about us moving in the authority and the presence of Christ. And so we move in His power, and we move by His Spirit, and we move by prayer, because that's the foundation of vision. Then the first thing Jesus says is go, which is an interesting concept for most churches, because their initial reaction is mostly to stay. We'll do our stuff in here, and if people want to join us, great. Well, again, decades ago, that may have worked. So it was a competition of programs, and as long as we have better potlucks than the Methodists, we win. We're not in that culture anymore. The culture has moved far away from the church. And so if we are going to get serious about seeing people come to Jesus, we're going to have to move outside of our walls in order to do that. They're not going to come anymore. Now, doesn't mean they never come, or it doesn't mean we can't use the church building, obviously, but what I'm saying is we have to have a mindset that takes us out into the world if we're serious about seeing people come to Jesus. And then He calls us to baptize them. Well, who gets baptized? New believers get baptized. So in the going, people come to know Jesus, get baptized, then we teach them to obey all that he has commanded us to go, and then those people are sent out into the world again. That's the model that Jesus has given for the church, and particularly the church in an unchurched culture. So let's ask the question another way. If Bethany or any church were to wake up one day and say, we really want to get serious about people coming to Jesus, well, what would that look like? It's not going to be putting signs out on the road. It's going to be because if people are going to come to Jesus, it's because they have relationships with Christians. And so how do we build those relationships? Well, we build those relationships by serving somewhere in the community well to do that. And so we go to the community, we serve, we focus. We can't go everywhere, we can't do everything, but we focus, we serve some group of people well, and because we focus on that group of people, we build relationships with them. As we build those relationships, they will start to ask the question, why are you people doing this? Well, that opens the door to the gospel, so the end result then is sharing Christ with people. So it's not a church growth mechanism, it's a kingdom principle. Now, if people do come to Jesus, and they do decide to come to church, where are they most likely to go to church? With people whom they have relationships with, and they feel safe with. So that's the spectrum that we move along. I think that's what the Great Commission calls us to do, and how we need to think in our day and culture, or we'll find ourselves sitting in lots of empty churches.
Yeah, that's an exciting concept, Bob, and I think it's refreshing. It's maybe some new ideas here at Bethany, and I think people are going to really get excited about some of these things. So, well, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope that this time has been helpful to you. We hope this has answered some of your questions, but maybe it's created some new questions in your mind. And if it has, please email them into us or give Lois a call with your questions, and if we get a few questions, we will do this again and try to answer more of them. So thanks for joining us. See you next time.